So logistics and planning. I always find this area of an adventure really quite fascinating because this is when it gets down to the nitty gritty. And you might go, well, there's no point planning anything until we know if we can find the money. But that process can take quite a long time. And therefore, you need to start thinking about certain things that you might want to put in place before you've actually got the green light on the funding. But for me, the enthusiasm of the trip is like, well, we're going to be doing this and we're going to find the money. We will find a way. So, because sometimes you think if that's the date that we need to go and we're still waiting for funding, we haven't done all of this stuff, then you could find yourself in the situation where somebody goes, okay, we'll do it, but you don't have enough time to plan it. So I would start getting going fairly soon on after you've come up with the idea. You've got the research in place, you've looked at the budget, you've assessed the cost, but these things are running in tandem with that. So there's certain things that I would suggest that you look at fairly early on as far as protocols are concerned for logistics. So when you start looking at the logistics of how does this operation happen, I think the first thing to do is you start to look at the route that you've researched. So for me, from a planning point of view, I like to sort of get going so we actually get a feel for the duration, the schedule, the stories, and how that's actually hanging together. And one way of doing that is putting a huge map on your wall. So if you've ever seen some of our shows, there's often a big map with a red wool line as to where we think we're going to go. And by doing that, it sort of puts in your head the reality of the trip, your start point, where you're hoping to be by when, some of the key points that you think you actually might want to visit on the way down, and why. In other words, there might be some stories that we've got to do that. You know, you might sort of say, listen, 100% if I'm going to India, I'm going to go to the Taj Mahal. Or for somebody like me, it's like, I'm definitely doing that overnight sleeper between Tbilisi and wherever. You know, so there's certain things that you put in that you know are cornerstones of your trip, and that's the route you're going to take. You also sort of know the time of year you're going. So that might determine whether or not you need to start factoring the weather and the heat and whether or not you need to avoid certain areas, or if you're going to go through it, what you actually have to do to prepare for that. Now, we spend a lot of time going on motorcycles. So it's also something where you might want to start scheduling in some of the training exercises. So we've done a lot of medical training exercises, but also survival training exercises. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we were going through Russia before, you know, we just sort of had a survival training exercise where if somebody came at you with a Kalashnikov or decided that they were going to try and hijack you or kidnap you, what would you do? So putting in these training classes is something which is a good idea to do, not only because of the safety element and the importance of it with regard to the security of the trip while it takes place, but it's also good to film. You know, people are put in almost sort of live experience situations, but you are learning about CPR and things like this. And I think it's the right thing to do to the trip, but it also gives you content before you go that is very, very valuable.
1, down, 2, 3.
I'll tell you what, I think there's one thing I really know, and that's I've got to get fitter.
Okay, you're right. You're right. Good. Just walk it up. You're right.
So an example of some of the preparations that has to happen in a timely manner are things like inoculations. Nowadays, you know, there's, you know, a lot of changing thoughts as to which inoculations you should have for which countries, or if you should be covered for rabies and how long does it last. But whichever way you look at it, you've got to respect that and make sure that your inoculations are done in a timely manner well before you leave. Depending on where you're going to fly into, you know, you might be thinking about tick-borne encephalitis, for instance, or rabies or cholera. And so somebody within your team should be looking at that and making sure that you go to a bona fide clinic to make sure that everybody in the team is covered. It's easy to think of the talent and the core production team, but there might be other people coming to visit, and they need to think about that. The other thing that you can think about is applying if you need it for a second passport. I think we've even in the past had a third passport, because sometimes if you're going to multiple countries, you can't put the visas in certain passports within a time window before you enter that country. So sometimes you have to leave a passport back in the UK or wherever your home production office is for the visas to be put in, which then have to be flown out to meet the team. So all of these things actually take a lot of time. And I remember when we visited Russia many, many years ago, it was almost a 6-month process then before you could get in to Russia. So somebody has to sort of wind the clock back from your anticipated start date to think, what do we need to do by when? Because if you get to D-Day when you're leaving and you haven't got all the right visas, then you're stuck. And visas can be a problem, and you do need somebody looking at that. I think also with regard to health and safety, it's not just inoculations, it's also making sure that somebody has had a look at all the issues in the countries that you're going to go through. And you might go, well, I don't want to take all the spontaneity out of my film, my adventure. But you would do that anyway. Even if you were just going on a holiday or an adventure on your own without filming, it's not very wise to go somewhere without actually having a look at some of the health issues that occur in that country and try to protect yourself from them. It can be down to a personal situation. But the other thing is your insurance. We tried to cover, obviously, the production insurance. We tried to cover for health insurance. Obviously, you've got maybe the different vehicles that you're traveling in. But there are things like kidnap and ransom insurance, where you would talk to your insurance broker. And obviously, some of this is very discreet, but it is certainly worth looking at that and making sure that you've done everything you can to make sure those insurance policies are robust and ready to be activated should you need them. And in that sense, the protocols of what's happening on the ground, should you be approached by somebody that wants to kidnap you, what do you do in that situation? I don't want to be over dramatic between life and death, but you don't want anyone to get hurt. And so you need to think about these things in a timely manner before you go. Obviously, that depends on where you're going. If your adventure travel documentary is around Norfolk, probably not so apt. But there are certain parts of the world, depending on what you're doing, that becomes vitally important. Part of the logistical planning is also a notional idea of the schedule. So if you did put your big map on the wall with your red line, you can sort of see where you might be at any one point of the trip, given that you might be in front or behind, or you might even dogleg off it because you really want to go and explore a story that you've discovered on the route. And I like personally putting those little pegs in and have the red bit of wool, because it just visualizes where you're going to go. And also when people come into your office for meetings about your trip, it's just fun for them to sort of see, what's going to happen. And when the researchers have started to find the stories around, your schedule and your talent, or the people that you're traveling with have signed off on some of these ideas, you can actually start to say, okay, we're definitely going to be here. We're definitely going to be here. This event is happening and we really want to attend it. There's an overnight train here that we particularly want to take from Tbilisi, for instance, or we're definitely going to the Taj Mahal. So it starts to sort of solidify certain elements of the trip, even though you've got a lot of spontaneity in it with regard to timing and the ability to actually stop and actually explore other stories and meet new people. It does give you some benchmark places. And why that's important is because if you've backed up a lot of your data onto one of your spare drives, you might say, well, that's where somebody's going to fly in to pick it up. And if that person's flying in to help pick it up and actually resupply the expedition with new chocolate bars or Marmite or whatever your passion is, or something more useful, more drives, camera lenses that have got broken, that person also might need visas and their passport to be considered in your planning. And if you've forgotten that person, by the time you start, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, that may not become possible. So sometimes it's a good idea to get your team around the table and brainstorm what could go wrong, what haven't we thought of. And in that respect, what I like doing when I think it's appropriate is making what I call a state of play document. And that document might end up being this thick, but it's got everything in it. It's literally from day one, it could be anything from insurance to petrol to safety to anything that might happen, budgets, everything's in it. And if you flick through it, at least it means nothing falls through the grate. And I think that's very important to make sure that no detail is missed. And the only way of doing that is to have something like this checklist, or what I call a state of play document, to cross-reference against. So when it comes to planning your schedule, as I said, I think there are stories that will always make the show because you've always been inspired to go to these places. And there might be other stories that you've investigated before you go. And of course, there's the stories that you're going to discover en route. And what's nice is to have some sort of schedule, but that's flexible enough to allow for that spontaneity. But also with the knowledge that you might need to drop some certain stories to keep on schedule. And with that in mind, the producer, the director, the talent will sometimes need to sort of, come together to say, okay, we haven't got time to do this, or we're going to shoot this, but we have to be out of here by 11 o'clock. And it's not that somebody can go, well, I haven't got this shot, you got to go. And there is sometimes those moments where that has to be said. And we've been like that before, where we know, as an example, I don't know if it's still happening, but there used to be a ferry that used to go from Egypt to Sudan. It went once a week. I couldn't believe it, but it went once a week, and we couldn't afford to miss it. So suddenly you're under pressure to make that. And so you have to think back to try and make sure that you don't put the whole team under stress just to try and hit one commitment. I think the other thing to do under logistics is think about communications and make sure that you have enough radios across all of the team, whether or not you've got support vehicles or motorbikes, or if you're ever going to break up. Communication between the team on the trip is essential. We'll talk about that later in filming techniques, but literally being able to talk to each other and communicate, particularly if there's no mobile phone signal. But even if there is a mobile phone signal, you want to be able to communicate back to your production base. Because I remember a time when we were in the Dakar Rally, and my car broke its rear wishbone. And we communicated back to London using our sat phone. And I think having sat phones is very, very important. And it was Lucy, who was back in London office, that communicated with somebody in Nouakchott who sourced a rear wishbone off a BMW that managed to get it back out into the desert, that rescued our project. Without that, that car would still be in the desert and we wouldn't have finished. So communications are vital. So you've got your telephones, you've got communications within the team, allowing the team to talk to itself, and sat phones. And potentially, depending on how you think about this, you might want trackers on your vehicles, possibly even individuals, so that if somebody wanders off or gets lost, you can actually find where they are. So all of these things need to be thought out under logistics before you go. Because sometimes when you're actually on the trip, it's too late to sort those problems out. So try and think and plan well in advance. So your transport choice is something else that you need to think about before you go. I don't know if you're going by car, motorbike, tuk-tuk, public transport. But certainly if you're taking your own vehicles, it's worthwhile planning some of the logistics or the support that you might need before you go. I mean, obviously things like the AA or roadside assistance, as much as you can ever get that, but you might need to prepare your cars in advance. For instance, when we were going through Africa or even through Russia, we put winches on the front, upgraded the suspension, put snorkels on them so that you can go through water, rivers if necessary. We had roof racks with fresh drinking water on the roof. We were able to sort of make sure that we'd prepared for the camping equipment to go on the roof in such a way that it's easy to get it off. And so all of these things come under logistical planning, just to make life on the road more efficient. The same applies for motorcycles or anything mechanical, even electric cars. You might want to take spare parts that you think could be used or fixed on the road. If there was any problem, you might also want to have the communication numbers to allow you to communicate back with your base station, so you might be able to solve problems, as we did on the road, without having to hold up the whole expedition. So have a think laterally about all the things that you need to do, but certainly thinking back from the day of departure to make sure that no deadline is missed is certainly a key way of actually making sure that you leave on time.